So we're joined by a number of people in the panel today, and we can all read, so I won't go through and read everything. I'm Dean Sondrager, I work for Wolters Kluwer. Today we're going to talk about really the impact of technology onto the law firm or the corporate legal department and how one quantifies value, and then how one prioritizes. So we'll talk about choosing a business problem, we'll talk about the kind of a model, if you will, for looking at how one looks at value, and then how one prioritizes. And then Patrick at the end is going to give us some practical guidance on vendor selection. And I'm actually in the process of vendor selection right now. We have a polling software that we're going to try and use in this presentation. This is like a beta test for us, so hopefully it'll go well. But if you want to go to your device and go to wolterskluwer.participol.com, what you will see when we do that is you will see something that looks a little like this. And as we go through the poll, you can just click on A, B, C, D. I think we won't have any more than 4 options, and we'll see how it works. And you see it says trial version up there. If it doesn't work out real well, we will not be selecting this vendor. So it's kind of our own mode of doing this. Oops, I probably need to turn my clicker on in order to continue here. So when we look at choosing a business problem, and we're going to try our first poll here, just informally, yes ma'am? Did I go too fast? Yes. There we go. I should have probably, in deference to, I don't know if Gina Grady's here today, but she always tells me that we should refer to our brand as CCH, not Wolters Kluwer. It would have been a much shorter URL had I chosen that. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and continue on. And so go ahead. How is it that you currently find yourself identifying business problems in your firm or in your corporation? You do talk to informal conversations. You go through a formal audit of some sort, networking with peers, networking with vendors. You probably do a little of all of these, so what would be the primary one? We can actually see, it looks like it's working. We can see the votes coming in here. I'll give it a second, which is kind of cool. Let's see if it continues to work. We'll hit up over the 50 threshold here, and then we'll go ahead and continue on. Okay. So, and if I click this, in theory, it should pop up and show me the results. And almost all comes through for informal conversations with attorneys. Very interesting. Any of you gentlemen have any opinions about that before we continue on?
Sure. Well, I think informal conversations with attorneys are great. But I think I'm actually sort of surprised to see no one selected formal knowledge audit, which I think is an extremely valuable way to obtain this kind of information. And I also think networking with peers is good because sometimes the people in your firm won't know it's a problem. Back to the Apple example, right? You know, you may only hear about the problem by talking with peers and figuring out, oh, well, it's a problem at your firm. Well, maybe it's a problem at mine. Now maybe I can bring that back and talk informally, or bring it up as an item in our formal knowledge audit.
Okay, well that's good.
That's good to know too. No, good to know. Again, this is why we test things before we purchase them.
And I would just add that I think networking with vendors is, and partnering with vendors is really important. I try to think of those relationships not as customer-seller relationships, but as collaborative relationships toward making products better. You know, I think vendors are very open to input and they're willing to change, and to the extent you can be part of that process, it's a lot smarter. And sometimes, you know, knowing vendors ahead of time, even before you might need that, knowing what's going on in the market, I think is helpful to us as knowledge management professionals.
Yeah, so I mean, and here's a quick list of some things here. I think that we talked about internal sources of conversations. I think Meredith Range had a great example yesterday. You also want to look at your business systems, and you know, if you find that you're not realizing you're billing on a particular area, that's a problem. And that's a problem that your management probably wants to solve. Peers, conversations, conferences like we've got right here. And then to Phil's point, I think that a lot of vendors in legal tech are more than happy to work with you. I think the key is, who is it that's working with you when you're in that engagement? Is it the sales team? Because the sales team's always going to talk to you, right? But ideally, you want to see management commitment and you want to see access to product managers, to development teams, things like that. That shows that the vendor is really working with you and looking to solve your problem. I think when we don't do that, we're looking to sell our solution. And so I think that that's an important distinction. Partnership involves people beyond the sales team on the vendor side.
Yeah, and if I can just throw an anecdote in there, there are a couple of vendors I recently got frustrated with because for a long time I was really only communicating with the salespeople. And recently, as I said, with a couple of vendors, I called the CEOs directly and said, hey, why don't you have this in your product? I've been asking your salespeople for 5 years for this to be in your product. And they said, well, we didn't hear this. And one of them said, we don't hear from any attorneys. We only get information filtered through the IT department. And I'm glad you called, and one thing led to another, and now they're building a new component of their tool based on our feedback. So bring it up the chain, don't be shy. They want to hear this, only in some organizations it's difficult for them to.
Yeah, and I think that just to echo that, the key phrase is I want to talk to the product manager, I want to talk to the CEO. Either one of those types of things, or the general manager, those things get you in touch with people that have a very different perspective than just the sales folks from the vendors, and they start asking questions about, oh, you want to do that? You want to do that? It's a very useful technique. I'm going to continue on, and I'm going to turn over to I believe Kingsley to talk through, but I want to talk real quickly about how one looks at the impact of technology just in general. And I have something I call the technology value chain. I wrote about this in Above the Law, but it's kind of an idea of saying as we evolve, when we look at workflows, and we look at the existing workflow, I think we think about things in terms of the 80-20 rule, right? Which is that 80% of the things I do to achieve any particular task are repetitive, that I don't really add a lot of value, but I gotta do them. And 20% or so is where the magic or so happens. And so if I look at that as my existing workflow and I say, well, how do I step up value for things or tools that I'm using? How do they help add value to that workflow? And technology in general is great because it allows you to automate things that you would otherwise be doing manually. And in a lot of cases, it allows you to automate things at scale so you can do things that you would not otherwise be able to do manually. And so the first thing that you start to see is that repetitive task portion, represented by the gray bar, starts to shrink down. All of a sudden, I'm doing the same job, but I'm able to do it in less time and put more time into the value add piece of it as a percentage of the overall work. And I have an example in the legal education industry that I'll share with you after this. And then the next step as we go up, though, says, if I have access to data and I have access to smart machines, I should be able to do more than just automate. I should be able to provide additional insight in some fashion that drives outcome. So when we think about value add, we go from where we're at to more efficient to outcome. Can I drive a better outcome? Analytics are built around trying to drive a better outcome in a result, be it in a transaction, contractual transaction, and be it in litigation, be it in other types of environments. And then on top of that, if I have access to a lot of data, I can benchmark. And if I can benchmark, I can say how good is my outcome compared to others, compared to peers, which has a great effect when I start to sell. There's nothing that tells me better when I'm selling to try and do business development, say, hey, we're at the 90th percentile, we're at the 95th percentile of outcomes for our customers on average. So we think about the idea of efficiency, outcome, and optimized outcome with a benchmark there. And just to give an example of it, oops, and it looks like my animation kind of went awry here. I picked a legal education example because I think it's, first of all, we're at a law school, and second of all, it's not something I'm directly selling, so I figured it was innocuous. But if you think about the legal education workflow, and I'm a student, what I'm doing to start off with is, as I go into testing, I develop study guides for myself based off the curriculum. I quiz myself, I work with my fellow students to try and see, do I have the material down pat, right? Well, if you look at legal education tools right now, they'll automate this process for you. So they'll create study guides for you. They'll create practice tests. They'll actually even grade the practice test and tell you how well you did. And this is not unique to legal education. This is nursing. This is just about any type of education that you've got there. So I've now made it easier for the student. I've hit the easy button for the student to be able to study. That's pretty cool. But what the cutting edge on legal education right now is adaptive learning, where I now look at what you got right and what you got wrong, and the next test that I give you has more of what you got wrong. Because you don't really need to study what you got down nearly so well. And on top of that, I can actually even move you to study materials for that matter, the things that you're not doing well. And if I'm good at it, I can even move you to study materials that are your preferred mode of learning. So I'm 50, I like to read things. You know, that's the way I learn. My kids who are 20 and 22, if they need to do something that they don't know how to do it, where do they go? Anybody think? There we go. That's right. That's right. They like video knowledge. Drives me nuts. I'm like, I don't want to listen to the whole thing there. And they're like, well, I don't want to read that whole thing. So it's a different mode of learning. But that's an example of reframing a problem where my original solution was curriculum and materials supporting that curriculum to I'm actually trying to get you to mastery of the subject. And as I do that, I move up the value chain. And I think there are examples of that in workflow throughout the legal market that there are analogs that we can talk about a little bit there. And so we will take one more step in here for a poll to see how well this works, see if the polling software works this time. And so as you look at projects that you're going to try and get greenlit for work here, are you trying to drive efficiency typically? Are you trying to drive outcome? And if you're driving outcome, is that for the firm? Is that outcome for your clients? Or is it something else? So let's see if we get a few votes that come in here. And perhaps the histogram will look correct now. If it's not, please raise your hand and tell me, and that way we'll know that we're not purchasing the software.
What do you think? Back to you. It'd probably be faster to do it from here, actually.
Okay, so
we can get it quicker. Yeah, thank you.
okay. So let's see what we've got here. Okay, and hopefully it is going to present. So we see a more reasonable histogram here, so that's interesting. So, commentary, gentlemen, it seems like we have kind of an even split across here. Does this match Phil and Patrick, kind of when you guys take an approach into projects in the firm?
I'm actually surprised there isn't more on efficiency, because I think that's where a lot of products and a lot of firms are focused. But this is very interesting and kind of delightful in a sense, because it really broadens the scope of what KM can do for firms.
Yeah, and I think it's, there's value to A, B, and C. I mean, if I had to pick, I might pick B just because I think clients are supreme, our supreme concern. But sometimes you want to do all of these things.
So now I'm going to turn the presentation over to my dear friend Kingsley Martin, who is going to take us through a little bit of the actual ways one measures these things, with a little bit of a flavor onto efficiency versus outcome.
I think that's right. And good morning, everyone. I'm Kingsley Martin. I am CEO of KM Standards, and that new title, Chief Contract Scientist for Accorda Corp. I just have a few seconds here, a few minutes, and I'm going to blast through this. But a little factoid, actually. I have an adaptive learning patent on LSAT training that I actually worked with a student in a class I taught to actually develop that software. What I'm going to do here, because actually I predate Eric's slides of yesterday that starts with a little plant in 2000, quite a bit before that. I'm not sure I'll even call it a seed, but let's say it's at least old. And what I'd like to do here is move through very quickly, essentially, the lessons learned over this long career in this area. And I'm going to share with you 4, and I'm going to explain them. The first is going back to the beginning of Sasuke. We are moving from bespoke to products. But as we'll see, law firm business models just do not align well with that. And on the other side of the coin, technology is moving from the most basic, the most objective, to much more nuanced and subjective. But I think the key for me and the reason why, and I've gone up and down in my excitement levels and pessimism regarding the legal technology, whether it ultimately is an oxymoron, that what we have today is an extraordinary capability of tools and technology. We can, through open source or incredibly inexpensive infrastructure systems, have access to incredibly powerful technologies. And finally, I think what we're going to see is that it's really going to focus on the content. I know how to, I program in multiple languages, but I no longer code, I train. I use these modern ML systems to be able to teach. You have access to them, everyone has access to them, and it's really how you should measure. So let's just quickly blast through this. proceed. Moving on.
Going down
The other way.
Keep going.
Okay. You went too far now?
There we go.
Okay. So the basic model is Suskins. We move from high end into a product. But the problem is that, is enough, it is, can you get this the right way?
Thank you. There you go.
It is up. Is that essentially when we look at law firms, I mean, they focus on the very low volume, very high value. And that's really a good area for bespoke. And on the other line, we have consumer, wills, trust, and et cetera, which is really the domain of Rocket Lawyer and LegalZoom. But of course, in the middle, this is where I tend to find myself moving towards, is the B2B. Law firms don't necessarily have a good model to fit in that space. It has to be highly efficient. And by the way, the Rocket Lawyers and LegalZooms don't necessarily have good products to deal with highly negotiated transactions. Well, when you look at this, and the various studies show, it's the biggest part of the market. Sorry, do you want to just...
Would you like me to
Yeah,
advance?
I've had a hard time with this.
There we go.
Okay.
Okay, so let's just jump a bit then. So within these three areas, to move on to the technology, I mean, what I've learned and what we've been building over time are these three different stages. And this is true, it doesn't really matter whether it's design assistant to help choose a car, design a system to essentially predict cases, or contracts. Step one, find the relevant material. Step two, find the relevant elements. And finally, determine the optimal outcome. Now, we have technologies across all of these spaces. We are having a hard time, aren't we? Are we on this? We have all of these technologies that are available to us right now. And essentially, today, in terms of find, we do research, we do search, and we can extract data. We can find the names of judges, we can find the names of contracts, the parties, the governing law, and the term. But the next stage is really where I'm focusing a lot at, is deconstructing and classifying those contracts. And this is where machine learning particularly comes into space. And at the final level, we have regression tools and deep learning. All of these are available. And to Mary Abrams, we have point solutions across every single one of these, but we do not and probably won't have for some time a generalized AI. So just wrapping up with sort of where we are today and changing this whole model, in terms of the background, we're moving from essentially a trust model. I pay a lot of money to a branded law firm, and I trust them to essentially give me a good product. But we are moving more and more into assurance, that I want to be able to show me metrics and models around what you are doing. And finally, it is very likely that we'll move into an insurance model. You can buy title insurance, you can buy reps and warranties insurance, and I think Phil's firm is actually working on quantification models of reps and warranties insurance. But I want to end with just a couple of examples. That one of the key things that I've learned is that, particularly in the contract area, we are moving from today's very traditional contracts, hopefully to the blockchain. But we've got to find a bridge. We can't just simply move from this archaic language to computer code. I don't think it's going to happen in that manner. The key to it is essentially what we heard from Netflix. It is simplification and standardization. There's a very appropriate lesson that I've learned recently working with the Canadian government. It's called the Phoenix system, that they tried to automate a payment system by simply automating current practices. It broke down. There was a period of flying around in Canada that I couldn't catch a plane without hearing Phoenix, because many of the government employees were paid through it. But the most important thing, and this is thinking about yesterday's presentation at DLA, that some of these metrics come from the business side. One of the things that we've done working with the Canadian government, I work with a department that spends $18 billion a year from pencils to naval warships, is that there is a cost to the current form of contracting. It's very inefficient. And what we're trying to do is simplify and standardize, and the lawyers say, well, how can you take my 70-page contract and reduce it to 5? What are you missing? You changed the risk profile. Well, we show them that it's very, very efficient to do this, and for this one department, there's a savings of $60 million a year if they do it. But the lawyers say, but what about all the risks? So again, applying quantifications, we did an insurance study to say, well, what happens if we looked at all of your claims and disputes and created, using actuarial models, essentially the amount that we put aside for a self-insurance pool? $5 million. So here's one of the first times we're beginning to get some real metrics around the lawyer conservatism that I need this 70-page contract. I can't deal with your 5%. It's costing this one department $55 million a year. And that's
Thank you.
Thanks, Kingsley. I'm going to try to address, in a clumsy way, maybe how to prioritize projects in this very dynamic world that we've heard about from John and Kingsley. If you're like me, you have a to-do list that gets longer every day. It's a little bit overwhelming trying to find a methodology to keep track of things and prioritize things. The real goal is to hit the target, not to try to put square pegs in round holes. How do you do this? And I'm listening to you this morning, John. I agree. I'm convinced design thinking is the way to go, and I also think there's the question, as you were hinting at, and you were implying too, Kingsley, of figuring out at what level are you going to pitch your prioritization? What is your role? What is your mission? And how high up the chain are you able to go? However, wherever that is, I think you have to have some methodology then to prioritize and to communicate. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the what that many of us are facing now, which I think is AI, cognitive technology, advanced technology, some sort of principles about thinking about those things in a pragmatic way, and then a methodology for prioritizing that I like to use. We know there are a lot of vendors. Many of these vendors are here. Very good solutions, evolving solutions, but very complicated, very difficult to integrate, to incorporate into our existing systems. I heard Dan Lewis of Ravel present the other day, and Ravel now owned by LexisNexis, and he said, don't anthropomorphize, if I'm saying that well, your software. It does not understand. Software is binary by nature, even the most complicated AI systems, and they will do things in ways that are, I think that's a real important thing to understand, and I like the idea of being disciplined about how we speak to people about it. Software does not understand things. And I think this Paul Chung, this was from a presentation by Paul Chung when he was with IBM Watson about the distinction between, we want humans to do what they do well, and we want machines to do what they do well. And as you prioritize and think about projects, I think that's always good to keep in mind. Sally Gonzalez recently highlighted the distinction between point solutions, and you were just referring to this, and there are some very good ones out there, Kira as a sort of an established example, versus a platform. And I think, we have to, I think ultimately we're sort of seeking platforms. That's what people want, a toolkit that we can use to solve multiple problems. And we also have to keep in mind the integration points. My firm has iManage as a document management system. One of my keys is I don't want to buy solutions that create a new content silo. Very simple, very hard to, is it hosted outside the firm? Is it inside? What are the risk policies and implications of that? For your firm. Rob Sconey did this, I think, at some point. He's the XM Law founder, and I like the sort of progression through some of the AI tools, where, ultimately with prediction, so thinking about where you are in this steps can be helpful. And I'm just going to go, I think I can go a couple steps forward and then backwards. This is just my clumsy chart about what are the kinds of things that AI can do. And I think some of these, e-discovery is well established, extraction due diligence well established. Others probably don't make sense for law firms. Big data mining, we don't have big data. So I think you could go sort of through these and think about what people are asking for, which are the tools that you might want to build inside, which are the things that a vendor with big data is more likely to do well for you. And how to prioritize, and this is something, again, Sally Gonzalez taught me. Oz has refined this. I think it's originally a McKinsey suggestion to place Post-its, and we did this on the wall with in quadrants, and based on value to the business as the vertical quadrant, and ease or difficulty as the horizontal quadrant, and that's in any dimension. It's expensive, there's politics, there's new technology, I use this for, and actually the quadrants are interesting to think about. The upper right is easy, they're highly valuable and they're easy to do, those are quick wins. The lower left is pain, they're hard and they're not very valuable, don't do them. What McKinsey teaches, I think, is that most organizations will do the quick wins and then go down and do the other easy things which become irrelevant. It's really important to discipline yourself to go left. But make sure you pick some hard projects that are going to give you a competitive advantage. I use this for my firm, the management committee, and my oversight committee to prioritize what the knowledge management team is doing generally. I also use a grid like this with every individual professional support lawyer and their oversight partners. And one key advantage of this, and O's added to what McKinsey did, a curve, which I don't have here, but you can imagine you have to do some of the get yourself organized things that are in the lower right. They don't really benefit the business, but you can't operate without them. And you can only do some of the hard things in it. And you could imagine a curve that moves based on your available resources. And the key thing is that you can identify things that you are not going to do. I think the typical approach of a partner law firm would be to say, here's 50 good things to do, put them on your list, and report back to me when they're done. And I think it's really important for KM people not to be transparent and clear about, I'm doing these things, I'm not doing these things, and why. And that's because I don't want my professional support lawyers, for example, to be walking around feeling guilty about all the things they're not doing. I want them to have a clear elevator speech, clear mission, and feel good about what they've done. And then, of course, we report on that. So I don't know if that's a helpful methodology.
Phil,
I find it very helpful.
Do you use the visual when you're talking to your management committee to actually kind of show them where things fall in as a justification for why you are or not doing the projects?
Yes, and I would go further and say we move the squares based on their input. We say, well, and I'll go with a proposed grid, and then I'll say, what do you think? And they'll say, well, I think that green one is more valuable, move it up, or it's harder than you thought, move it left. And that process is really good. They feel like it's a very visual way for people to participate and understand why, and then ideally you reach consensus, and then you take some of them off the grid and say, okay, those are the ones we're not doing. And then you have to go farther and project manage and schedule and report on that. So I hope that's helpful.
Are you going backwards?
Backwards. Don't go backwards. That's a. Oh, and actually, how many people here have used Spellcheck? How many people ever did a proof of concept for Spellcheck? How many people think Spellcheck is perfect? I think AI, this is my radical thought of the day, it's almost like we're being told that there's this great technology. Imagine if somebody said to you, there's a great technology, it's called Spellcheck. All you have to do is teach it English, and then it's going to be great. Would you use it? I think at some point the tools will be taught, like finding an actual employment agreement in some years in the future. I'm not sure who's going to do it, but it will be trivial. There'll be search engines and AI that can do that. Right now we don't have that. We're not sure who's going to bring this up to speed in the legal market, but we do not have an infinite number of problems, an infinite number of document types. Someone will, who trained Spellcheck to cover Greek? We don't know, don't even know, just take it for granted. At some point, some of the things that we're talking about as novel will be like that.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Which one is forward? I just want to make sure I get this right. Up, okay, great. So before we get into the conversation, let's do a poll. So how did you select your last few vendors? And it sounds like this is a single select option, right, Dean?
Yes.
So you might have a combination, but let's just go with, how did you select it? So the demo looked good. Someone in the organization, whether it be a partner, CIO, CKO, used it at another firm and said, okay, I use it here, it was great, we're going to use it. I used it there, we're going to use it here. Or someone bought me dinner, and now I feel like I'm indebted to them somehow. And lastly, I don't know, another department does this, and then I just deal with whatever they bought. Maybe there's an E somewhere out there, but to keep it simple, I kept it at 4. So we'll see people start to vote. We got 32. Let's see if we get a few more. I actually have no idea what the results will be. I cannot guess.
Definitely need to not give up. Yeah. Kathy just goes, I give myself more credit when
All right, we seem to be, okay, there we go. I'll see if I can get it to 50.
Yeah, so you just press and then pause.
All right, so I'm gonna move ahead and let's see what it says.
Just takes a second. In theory. There we go.
Okay.
Demo
Demo
looked good.
looked good. All right.
Of the choices that
we
were
have
available,
a good
yeah.
conversation to have here. The reason why I felt strongly that a component of this session needed to cover how you select vendors is because lately I've had a lot of conversations with people at different firms, and it was clear that the way they chose vendors was shall I say, an imperfect way to do it. And we are guilty as anyone else is, but I think we've gotten better relatively recently in the past maybe 5 years or so. We've gotten a lot better than we have in the past. So of course, if you select the wrong vendor, this is what you look like. A little, maybe there's more embarrassment in there than it shows in this person's face. So what are the risks of doing this, what I'll call low touch vendor selection? So demo looked good. Of course it did, right? Like the demos always look good. It's very easy to fall in love with the product in an hour. It's like speed dating, right? It's all of a sudden you think, well, look, think of all the possibilities. Of course, what you should really be using the demos for is a time to be skeptical, to think of, okay, well, interesting, this product has all these features. Let's remember that. Let's start making a list of requirements. Let's start thinking about what this product doesn't have. I think probably a lot of people in this room, when they see the demos, sometimes it's interesting to see what the features are, but a lot of the time you start to say, well, why doesn't it have this? Why doesn't it have this? Right? It's a time to be creative with what you want. So it came from another firm. So whenever someone comes and says, well, we use this at our last firm, the first thing you should think of is, well, does that make sense for us? How is our firm different from your firm? Do we have different needs than your last firm? What was the methodology used to select this vendor? Was it great? Did you go through a really formal process and it allowed you to make the right decision, or did you just see the demo and that's it? You did no due diligence, and do I trust that you selected the right vendor for your firm at all? So the other thing is, sometimes, especially with new products, maybe now there's only one vendor out there, so it's the only game in town, so maybe due diligence isn't all that important. You want to take a risk, and maybe the cost is not so high, but maybe 5 years later, there are 5 different competing vendors, and maybe the landscape has changed. So finally, okay, so they bought me dinner, right? Of course, personal relationships are extremely valuable. They put you in a great position to influence technology development. And they're also good because these are really smart, creative people we're dealing with and sometimes socializing with. Everyone here is here in a large part because we want to talk with the rest of the people here. This is great. It's a time for exchanging ideas and hoping that we can talk to the right people who will give us ideas to bring back to our organization. But I think the vendors are here also to think of, okay, how can I make my product better? But the downside to this is we are all susceptible to bias, right? And we are the human animal. We are social animals. We love to connect with other people. Don't let that bias your vendor selection decision. That, I think, is a big risk. And I think very often, I think probably more than we've seen in the poll, I think this will drive vendor selection in a way that is natural but not beneficial to the organization. So lastly, I don't know, another business department does this. One of the big challenges when it comes to vendor selection is get the right team at the table. I'm sure we've all had that experience where another group bought something and you think, well, I could use that. Or you bought something and then later someone says, well, I could use that. And then it turns out the tool that you selected doesn't have all the features that everyone in the firm would want. So the takeaway here is try when you can to think of the enterprise. I can think of, there was a product we were looking for during the year, and when we called our references to talk about how they use it, we found out that most of other firms had 2 or 3 products in the same firm to do the same thing, right? Especially for smaller size firms, and I think it probably applies also to big firms, but maybe you have more latitude there culturally. But in smaller firms, that's just not possible. You can't. Why spend $200,000 when you can spend 50? So, cast a wide net. So I'm going to zip through this because I think we're starting to run out of time. But basically, there are political benefits to reaching out, as I mentioned before. You want the whole team to feel included. You want to make sure that team is as big as is appropriate for the given technology you're looking to select. Silo risk is real. You want a diversity of views at the table when you're selecting something, because that just more ideas makes for a better vendor selection process. I think anyone who's gone through this can see that. Of course, there is a risk. If you put everyone around the table and you realize, okay, there are now 20 people in the room, we need more chairs, and then it's just there is a size that is too big, and I think that's something you just kind of feel out as you go through the process and figure, okay, well, maybe this person doesn't need to be here. And sometimes people will just bow out because they realize they don't need to be represented. Did I go too far? So finding potential solutions, you can do research. We actually started a database of vendors internally. Google is always great. ILTA message boards, I think that's my go-to spot. You just type into the ILTA message boards your term, and then you see a list of sometimes hundreds of posts about different technology solutions. And then you just start to talk to people, ask around. Demos are great. They allow you to get to know the company. And sometimes, it's nice just to put out feelers. You hear about something new, you have a very informal say, we're not going to buy anything this year, but I want to know more about your company just so I know what you do. So when I start to hear about problems that your company might be able to address, I know who to call. RFPs. So I think these are very, very important. And it does take effort to go through this process. But essentially, going through the RFP process with your vendors allows you to first to formally articulate what you want out of the vendor, which is extremely important, but also give you a mechanism to compare apples to apples, multiple vendors. So the way we do it is pretty basic. We have a spreadsheet. We have it's called a requirements matrix, but it's not really requirements in a formal sense. It's more of, these are the things that I'd like to see. Some of them are requirements, some of them are necessary, some of them are dreams that we know no one will have, but we're interested in seeing how do they respond to this outlandish request, right? That's sort of a dream, but if they say, no, we don't have it, that says one thing. If they say, no, we don't have it, but this is a really cool idea, let's talk about it and let's see if we can develop it because we think our other clients would like to have this feature.
And would you agree, Patrick, that this phase is not trivial and it's where the design thinking element
Yes, absolutely.
comes in, right? What business problem are we trying to solve, and how do we want? What is our vision for
and
doing
this
it?
this takes a lot of time to put together if you're starting from scratch. It really, and as I said before, when you see the demos, that's the time to be thinking about which of the elements am I seeing during this demo do I want to put on that requirements matrix.
And if I can hop in, there's one thing I would point out too, is that there's there's a couple different flavors of RFP processes that you can go through. You can create, basically, this is the script that I wish to see based on my requirements and bake off vendors that come through. And so if you have a fairly well-formed business problem, that's a great way to do it. So if you think about a CRM system or an accounting system, something like that, there's not a lot of variability in what you're going to get from those. And so you can do that. If you're talking about something that's an emerging technology, typically what you want to do is you want to have a conversation with the vendor and see where their thoughts are and allow them to influence you a little in that process, because to Patrick's point, you may not know where your opportunities are there. Doesn't mean that you let them change your requirements. It just means that you want to have not quite the same arm's length RFP process that you would go through if you were sourcing a new accounting system.
And in that situation, you actually might be doing an RFP with consultants who are going to help you with the design.
Right.
So, yes, exactly right. So, when we get the responses back, it's in an Excel spreadsheet. You have each row is a different requirement. Each column is a different vendor. And what I'll do is I'll just read through, I'll highlight the answers that I like, and then in a very rough way, it's not very scientific, but it's very quick to be able to see, okay, now I see, oh, this vendor, it has all the highlight, it has more highlights than these other two. And then you review it again, and I found usually when we go through this process, within 20 minutes of sitting down with your team, you see we have to go with this one. It would be irrational to go with anyone else. This is the one that fits for what we need. One note on what often drives a decision, it often comes down to price, and for us, we put a high premium on market penetration. In the past, there have been some startups where we took a chance and they didn't have the necessary market penetration to stay alive. So it takes a lot for us to go with a company that only has 1% market share. But today things are moving very fast, and if your firm is willing to take more risk than we are, certainly go for it. Sometimes it's good to be first. So checking references. It's always good to have a script. We didn't always have a script, but now we always have a script. And it allows you to move very quickly, be respectful of the people's time that you're speaking with about the selection that they've gone through and their familiarity with the vendor. It's really interesting, back to the original poll that we saw. It sounds like not a lot of firms are doing this. And frankly, we went through this recently with a product, and we found that with only one exception, we talked to 6 references, only one had gone through this. All the other ones hadn't, and some it made sense. Some they bought a very early stage technology where at the time they bought it, there was no competition. But there were some that just said, oh, I saw the demo, or I met them at a conference, and they seemed like nice people, so we bought it. And sometimes you get lucky and that works, but there is a risk that when you don't go through that, you are supporting companies that shouldn't be supported, right? And the takeaway I want to leave you with is, if we all had a more formal process around this, we'd be able, as an industry, to more quickly weed out vendors that didn't really provide value, as much value as their competitors do, and let the quality rise to the top faster. That said, whether or not to go through this whole process, you don't always need to go through this whole process. Sometimes you're not talking about a huge amount of money. Sometimes it's worth taking the risk. There are all sorts of other reasons why going through this process, which takes a fair amount of time and resources, isn't worth the trouble. So you'll have to make that evaluation yourself for each vendor.
Thank you very much, Patrick. And I think that we're probably at our time, so thank you all, and we'll be around during the break if anybody has questions or things like that. Thank you.